This HOA Karen thought she could abuse her power to tow my boat. What happened was that she ended up losing everything. When she filed a false report to get a tow truck on my property, she didn't realize she was messing with federal law. Not only did the Coast Guard step in and launch a criminal investigation against her, but my neighbors held an emergency meeting and officially stripped her of her presidency. Watch how one power trip completely ruined this Karen's life. I had just returned from a weekend fishing trip and wanted to rinse off the saltwater before storing it properly. My boat was a 23-foot center console that I kept on a trailer. The HOA rules clearly stated that boats could be parked in driveways for up to 72 hours for maintenance purposes. I had checked the regulations multiple times before even buying the boat. Everything I was doing was completely legal according to our neighborhood covenants. But Karen, our HOA president, had different ideas about what belonged in her perfect little community. She came storming across the street the moment she spotted my boat. Her face was already red with anger before she even reached my property line. I could tell this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. She immediately started yelling about how boats were prohibited in the neighborhood. I calmly pulled out my phone and showed her the exact HOA rule that allowed temporary boat parking for maintenance. She barely glanced at the screen before dismissing it completely. According to Karen, the rule didn't matter because she personally found boats to be eyesores. She claimed they lowered property values and made the neighborhood look like a trailer park. I tried explaining that I was well within my rights and would have the boat put away within the allowed time frame. She wasn't interested in hearing any of it. Karen then threatened to have my boat towed immediately if I didn't move it within the next hour. I reminded her again about the 72-hour rule and suggested she review the HOA documents herself. She just laughed and said rules were subject to her interpretation as president. That's when I realized she wasn't going to listen to reason. She walked away muttering about taking action and teaching me a lesson about respecting community standards. I went back to cleaning my boat, hoping she would cool down and realize how unreasonable she was being. I should have known better than to expect rational behavior from someone drunk on HOA power. 2 hours later, I heard a loud diesel engine rumbling down the street. A massive tow truck was slowly approaching my house. My stomach dropped when I saw Karen standing on her front lawn with her arms crossed and a satisfied smirk on her face. She had actually called a towing company to remove my boat from my own property. The tow truck driver pulled up and stepped out looking confused. He walked over to my driveway and started examining the boat and trailer. I immediately went outside to confront the situation before things got out of hand. The driver seemed like a reasonable guy who was just trying to do his job. I explained to the driver that the boat was legally parked according to HOA regulations and that I had not authorized any towing. He scratched his head and said he received a call from the HOA president claiming the boat was illegally parked and needed immediate removal. I showed him the HOA documents on my phone highlighting the 72-hour maintenance rule. The driver read through it carefully and then looked over at Karen, who was still watching from across the street. He told me he wasn't comfortable towing the boat without proper legal authorization. That's when Karen came marching over again, this time waving some papers in the air. She claimed she had written authorization as HOA president to remove any vehicle or vessel she deemed inappropriate for the neighborhood. The tow truck driver asked to see the documentation. Karen handed him a letter she had apparently written herself on HOA letterhead. It stated that boats were prohibited from being visible from the street at any time for any reason. The driver looked at me, then at Karen, then back at the letter. He said he needed to make a phone call to his supervisor before proceeding. Karen's face turned even redder and she started yelling about how she was the authority in this neighborhood and her word was final. While the driver was on the phone, I called my lawyer to get advice on the situation. My attorney told me not to allow the towing under any circumstances and that Karen was clearly overstepping her authority. He said if they touched my boat, it would constitute theft and I should call the police immediately. I relayed this information to the tow truck driver who was already looking uncomfortable with the entire situation. His supervisor apparently told him the same thing because he started walking back toward his truck. Karen absolutely lost her mind at this point. She started screaming at the driver, calling him incompetent and threatening to report his company. The driver calmly explained that he couldn't legally tow a vehicle from private property without proper authorization from law enforcement or a legitimate repossession order. Karen's homemade letter didn't qualify as legal documentation. She then threatened to call the police herself and have me arrested for violating HOA rules. The driver just shrugged, got in his truck, and drove away. I thought that would be the end of it, but Karen had only just begun her campaign. Over the next hour, Karen made at least a dozen phone calls. She called 3 more towing companies, all of whom refused to touch my boat after hearing the details. She called the local police department claiming I was running an illegal boat storage business from my home. The officer who responded took one look at my single boat and talked to me for about 5 minutes before determining there was no violation. He politely told Karen to stop wasting police resources on HOA disputes. She called code enforcement claiming my boat violated zoning regulations. They scheduled an inspection for the following week but told her that boats on trailers were generally permitted. Nothing was working out the way Karen had planned. That's when she made her biggest mistake. In her frustration, Karen decided to call the Coast Guard. She somehow got it in her head that boats required special permits to be on land and that I was violating federal maritime law. She told the Coast Guard dispatcher that I was illegally harboring a vessel without proper documentation and that I was potentially involved in smuggling operations. Yes, she actually accused me of smuggling. The dispatcher took her information and said they would send someone to investigate. Karen hung up the phone looking triumphant. She actually believed the Coast Guard was going to come arrest me and confiscate my boat. What Karen didn't understand was that making false reports to federal agencies is a serious crime. She also didn't realize that the Coast Guard doesn't appreciate having their time wasted on petty neighborhood disputes. 2 days later, on Monday afternoon, a Coast Guard vehicle pulled into the neighborhood. Karen saw it from her window and came running outside like she had just won the lottery. She was practically giddy with excitement. 2 Coast Guard officers stepped out of the vehicle in their uniforms. They looked very official and very serious. Karen rushed over to them before they even reached my house. She started talking rapidly, telling them about my boat and how I refused to follow her rules. She claimed I was a danger to the community and that my vessel was improperly stored. The officers listened politely without interrupting. When she finally paused for breath, one of the officers asked her if she was the person who filed the complaint. Karen proudly confirmed that yes, she was the HOA president and she had called them to handle this serious violation. The officer nodded slowly and then asked to speak with me. Karen tried to follow them to my door, but they politely asked her to wait by their vehicle. I invited the officers inside and we sat down at my kitchen table. They explained they were following up on a complaint about an improperly documented vessel. I showed them all my boat registration, Coast Guard documentation, and insurance papers. Everything was completely in order and up to date. The officers examined each document carefully and then asked to see the boat itself. We walked outside and they conducted a thorough inspection. They checked the hull identification number, looked at the safety equipment, and examined the trailer registration. After about 20 minutes, they confirmed everything was perfectly legal and properly maintained. Then one of the officers asked me about the HOA situation. I explained the entire story, including Karen's multiple attempts to have my boat towed despite the clear HOA rules allowing temporary parking. I showed them the relevant sections of the HOA covenant. The officer took notes and asked if I had any documentation of Karen's harassment. I pulled up my doorbell camera footage showing her various confrontations and threats. The officers watched several clips and exchanged concerned glances. They thanked me for my cooperation and said they needed to speak with the complainant again. Karen was still waiting by their vehicle, looking impatient and annoyed. The officers approached her with very different expressions than before. One of them asked her to explain exactly what violations she believed I was committing. Karen launched into another rant about HOA rules and neighborhood standards. The officer let her finish, and then calmly explained that nothing about my boat violated any federal, state, or local maritime laws. Karen's face fell slightly, but she insisted there must be something wrong because boats shouldn't be allowed in residential driveways. The officer then explained that HOA rules don't supersede my legal right to park my properly registered boat on my own property. Karen started arguing, saying that as HOA president she had the authority to enforce community standards. That's when the second officer stepped in. He very clearly explained that filing a false report with the Coast Guard is a federal offense. Karen's confident expression completely vanished. She stammered something about just trying to protect the neighborhood. The officer continued, stating that accusing someone of smuggling without any evidence constitutes making false statements to federal officers. Karen went pale and started backpedaling immediately. She claimed she never said anything about smuggling. The officer pulled out his notes showing the exact complaint filed with the dispatcher. The conversation got very serious very quickly. The officers explained that they had driven over an hour to respond to this complaint, taking them away from actual maritime safety issues. They said that wasting federal resources on personal vendettas was unacceptable. Karen tried to apologize and claim it was all a misunderstanding. The officers weren't buying it. They informed her that they would be filing a report about the false complaint and that she might be contacted by federal investigators. Karen looked like she might faint right there on the street. All her bravado and authority had evaporated in seconds. Before leaving, one of the officers turned to address the small crowd of neighbors that had gathered. He loudly stated that my boat was completely legal and properly documented. He said that any further harassment regarding the vessel could result in additional legal consequences. He looked directly at Karen when he said this. Then the officers got in their vehicle and drove away. Karen stood frozen in her driveway, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The neighbors who had gathered started whispering among themselves. Several people who had always supported Karen's strict enforcement suddenly looked uncomfortable. I went back inside my house and honestly just sat there processing what had happened. Within an hour, my phone started buzzing with messages from neighbors. People I barely knew were reaching out to express support. Several admitted they had been afraid to challenge Karen's authority before but were glad someone finally stood up to her. A few neighbors apologized for not speaking up during previous HOA disputes. The neighborhood group chat was absolutely exploding with commentary. For once, people were openly questioning Karen's leadership and methods. That evening, I received an email from the HOA board. It was from the vice president, not Karen. The email stated that the board was reviewing the boat parking incident and would be discussing HOA enforcement policies at the next meeting. It was a very diplomatic way of saying they were distancing themselves from Karen's actions. I replied thanking them and attached the relevant HOA rules along with my boat documentation. I wanted everything on record in case Karen tried to retaliate further. My lawyer had advised me to document absolutely everything. The next day, Karen's car was gone from her driveway most of the day. Neighbors speculated she was meeting with lawyers or trying to figure out how to handle the federal complaint. Nobody had seen her outside since the Coast Guard visit. Her usual morning walks around the neighborhood inspecting for violations had completely stopped. The sudden absence of her constant surveillance felt strange to everyone. People joked that they could finally relax in their own yards without being watched. The atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted noticeably. By Wednesday, official-looking mail started arriving at Karen's house. Neighbors noticed multiple certified letters that required signatures. While nobody knew exactly what they contained, the timing suggested they were related to the Coast Guard incident. Karen's husband was spotted carrying in a large envelope from a law firm. The gossip mill was working overtime. Some neighbors felt bad for Karen, but most felt she had brought this on herself through years of aggressive HOA enforcement. This wasn't her first controversy, just her biggest one. The following HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening. Usually only about 10 people attended these meetings. This time, over 40 residents showed up. The community room was packed with people standing along the walls. Karen arrived late and sat in the back instead of her usual position at the front table. She looked exhausted and defeated. The vice president ran the meeting and immediately addressed the boat parking incident. He clarified that the HOA rules clearly allowed temporary boat parking for maintenance and that enforcement had been improperly applied. Several residents stood up to share their own stories of overzealous HOA enforcement. One neighbor talked about being fined for having the wrong shade of mailbox. Another described being threatened with legal action for planting flowers without approval. A third resident detailed how Karen had tried to force them to remove a basketball hoop that was completely within the rules. Story after story revealed a pattern of harassment and power abuse. Karen sat silently through all of it, staring at the floor. The board members looked increasingly uncomfortable as they realized how widespread the problem had become. Then one of the longtime residents stood up and made a motion for a vote of no confidence in the current HOA president. The room went silent. Someone quickly seconded the motion. The vice president looked panicked and tried to table the discussion, but residents demanded an immediate vote. According to HOA bylaws, such a vote required a simple majority of attending members. The vote was called and the result wasn't even close. Over 35 residents voted in favor of removing Karen from her position. Only 3 voted against. Karen was officially removed as HOA president effective immediately. She stood up without saying a word and walked out of the meeting. Her face was completely expressionless. A few people tried to stop her to talk, but she just kept walking to her car and drove away. The meeting continued for another hour discussing reforms and new leadership. The vice president agreed to serve as interim president until proper elections could be held. The board voted to review all HOA rules and enforcement policies. They also agreed to implement an appeals process for residents who felt they were being unfairly targeted. The entire power structure of the HOA had changed in one evening. Over the next few weeks, things continued to develop. Karen's house went up for sale. Neighbors whispered that she and her husband were moving to avoid the embarrassment and potential legal consequences. The federal investigation into her false Coast Guard report was apparently ongoing. While criminal charges seemed unlikely, she had been warned about future conduct. The stress of everything had clearly become too much. Within 2 months, the house sold and Karen moved away without saying goodbye to anyone. The new HOA leadership was completely different. They focused on actual community improvement rather than petty rule enforcement. Fines decreased dramatically. Approval processes became simpler and more transparent. Residents actually started enjoying their neighborhood again instead of living in fear of violations. The change was remarkable. People began hosting block parties and community events. Neighbors who had barely spoken before started building friendships. The whole atmosphere became welcoming instead of hostile. My boat stayed in my driveway for the full 72 hours allowed for maintenance. Nobody complained, nobody called tow trucks, nobody contacted federal agencies. I finished cleaning it, performed some minor repairs, and then moved it to storage as planned. It was the most peaceful boat maintenance I had ever done. Several neighbors stopped by to chat while I worked. A few asked about fishing spots and boat recommendations. One neighbor even asked if I would take his family out on the water sometime. The boat that Karen had seen as a threat to property values became a conversation starter and community connector. The Coast Guard incident became legendary in our neighborhood. New residents who moved in later always heard the story eventually. It served as a cautionary tale about HOA overreach and the importance of knowing actual laws versus made-up rules. Karen's name became synonymous with unnecessary enforcement and abuse of minor authority. Nobody wanted to be the next Karen. The story even spread to neighboring communities through social media. Other HOA boards heard about it, and some reportedly used it as an example of what not to do. Looking back, I never intended to become the person who took down an HOA president. I just wanted to clean my boat in peace. But Karen's obsession with control and her willingness to abuse her position created the situation. Her decision to involve federal agencies in a petty dispute was the final straw that broke everything apart. If she had just followed the HOA rules she claimed to care so much about, none of this would have happened. Instead, her need to win every battle cost her everything. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Karen spent years terrorizing neighbors over minor rule violations. She fined people for grass being a half-inch too tall. She sent violation notices for Christmas lights being up one day past the deadline. She threatened legal action over garden gnomes and painted mailboxes. But when she decided to ignore the actual rules to target my boat, she encountered something she couldn't bully or intimidate. Federal officers don't care about HOA politics. They care about facts and laws, and the facts clearly showed Karen had wasted their time and resources on a personal vendetta. The neighborhood learned valuable lessons from the entire experience. Residents realized they had more power than they thought. HOA boards work for the community, not the other way around. Rules should be applied fairly and consistently, not weaponized against people someone personally dislikes. And perhaps most importantly, there are limits to HOA authority. They can't override actual laws, and they definitely can't make false reports to federal agencies without consequences. These lessons transformed how our community operated going forward. My relationship with my neighbors improved dramatically after everything settled down. People felt comfortable approaching me because I had stood up to the neighborhood bully. I became friends with several families I had barely known before. We started a neighborhood watch program that actually focused on safety rather than rule enforcement. Community engagement increased across the board. The neighborhood became the friendly place it was supposed to be all along. All because one person's overreach finally went too far. Karen's replacement as HOA president was a retired teacher named Margaret who believed in common sense and kindness. She often said her goal was to make the HOA invisible to residents who were just living their lives peacefully. Enforcement focused on actual problems like safety hazards and property abandonment. Petty complaints were dismissed unless they involved genuine issues. The number of violation notices dropped by over 90% in the first year. Resident satisfaction increased dramatically. Property values actually went up, disproving Karen's theory that boats in driveways would tank the market. I still own my boat and take it out regularly. Sometimes I park it in my driveway for maintenance, always within the allowed time frame. Nobody has complained once since Karen left. In fact, several neighbors have bought boats themselves, and we've formed an informal fishing club. We share tips, organize group trips, and help each other with maintenance. The very thing Karen tried to ban became a community bonding activity. It's amazing what happens when people are allowed to enjoy their property and hobbies without constant harassment. The Coast Guard officers never returned to our neighborhood, which was exactly how it should be. Their time is valuable and should be spent on actual maritime safety and security issues. I sometimes wonder if they tell the story of the HOA president who called them about a boat in a driveway. It probably stands out among their more serious cases. I hope it serves as a memorable example of why people shouldn't waste federal resources on personal disputes. Those officers were professional and fair throughout the entire situation. They did their jobs properly and set the record straight about what actually matters under the law. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like and subscribe for more crazy HOA battles and neighborhood drama every week. And tell me in the comments below what you would have done in this situation. Would you have stood your ground like I did, or would you have just moved the boat to avoid the conflict? Let me know your thoughts and share your own HOA horror stories.